All right, in this particular lesson, we're going to talk about exactly how organisms in an environment interact with one another and the relationships that they form with one another. So we're really going to focus on that specific aspect. You should be relatively familiar with the concept of a predator-prey relationship. I think that this is probably fourth grade material to you guys, but this is a type of interaction between organisms living in the same environment, in the same ecosystem. There are organisms that are naturally going to eat others. So the predator being the consumer and the prey being the organism that's being eaten. In addition, we have a slightly more complex type of relationship. We refer to them as symbiotic relationships. So this is going to be relationships where the two organisms involved are going to have a long-standing or long-lasting relationship. It's not going to be quick because they're not really trying to kill one another in order to feed. So we have three types: parasitism, mutualism, and commensalism, that we're going to discuss in symbiotic relationships. Parasitism. I'm guessing parasitism is familiar because of the word parasite. And that's exactly what parasitism is. This is when there's a parasite that's living in or on a host organism. In the case of parasitism, we say that one organism benefits and the other is harmed. This is positive for the parasite, but negative for the host organism. Some examples being lice, fleas, ticks, tapeworms, and there are a wide variety of other parasitic organisms that exist. Mutualism is our second type of symbiotic relationship. This is a mutual relationship. We say that in mutualistic relationship, both organisms benefit. It's positive for both. So in this case, we have a bee and a flower. The questions that we're asking is how the bee is benefiting versus how is the flower benefiting. Well, what does the bee get? Well, the bee gets pollen, nectar, for food, right? And as a result, the flower gets pollinated, right? What happens is that it gets fertilized for reproduction. Without that bee pollinating the flower, it may not be able to reproduce. So that mutualistic relationship where both of them are getting something positive out of the relationship and neither one is being harmed. Then we have a type called commensalism. In commensalism, we say that the one organism benefits, but other isn't really helped or harmed, right? It's kind of like a neutral thing. So the example that we have here is a clownfish and a sea anemone. Occasionally, depending on where you look, you'll often find that what they have is a mutualistic relationship. However, I'm going to go with a commensalism relationship in this case because the clownfish is getting great things, right? Clownfish has a layer, right, a slimy mucus layer. It secretes a layer of film around itself to protect itself from the sea anemone's stingers, right? Sea anemones sting and are harmful to other organisms, the predators of the clownfish. So the clownfish gets a home in the anemone, and in addition, it also is able to get protection because larger predators stay away from the anemone and don't bother the clownfish when the clownfish is near it. The clownfish doesn't get harmed at all by the anemone, it's only benefiting. However, the anemone isn't really getting much. Some people may argue that the anemone gets particles of food that the clownfish drops, but really, right, as those tentacles are kind of like swaying in the ocean current and kind of moving, they're filtering the water and all of the little particulate matter that's in the water in order to get their food. They're not really depending on Nemo, on the clownfish, for food source. So commensalism is a better way to explain that, because the anemone is not really getting anything, but it's not really being hurt in the process of the clownfish living there. Organisms can also interact with one another competitively. All right? In competition, the idea is that both organisms want the same thing. They want the same food, water, mate, etc., and that competition is necessary for their survival. So this little table kind of sums up whether these different relationships are good or bad for organisms. And that competition factor that we were talking about, continuing on about it, competition is really dependent on a niche, all right? On the particular job that an organism fills and what its role is in the environment. If multiple organisms fill the same niche, then they're going to inevitably compete with one another. They're going to run into one another when they're trying to do those exact same jobs, and they're going to end up fighting over them. So the space that they need, the food that they need, the reproduction that they need, all these things are jobs that they do. They need to eat. They need to reproduce. A job is reproducing. So the niche is really what its purpose is. So for example, asking you if you can tell me what exactly an oak tree's niche is, and write down all of the different jobs in the environment that an oak tree fulfills. And knowing that there's quite a few, right? An oak tree has the job of absorbing sunlight, and the reason it needs to absorb that sunlight and absorb the water and minerals from the soil, all right, is for that photosynthesis. Sorry. Photosynthesis to start the food web, right? To really get things going. Organisms are provided shelter by an oak tree, shade from the oak tree. Other creeping plants may climb up the oak tree as they grow. It's a source of food for some organisms. It provides ground coverage in the fall and winter for some organisms to be able to survive through those colder months. And there are many more. So understanding that there are a lot of different roles that different organisms play in the environment. It's not just immediately what you think of, but there are a lot of different things that depend on that organism fulfilling its niche. So the idea, like I said, when two organisms have the same niche, they're going to compete. And then we have a concept called biodiversity. We know that bio, we're talking about life or living things. Diversity, we're really talking about differences. All right? And this is all about variety of organisms. And it's really important to recognize that a wide variety of organisms in an environment is a positive thing, because that means that there's going to be less competition. They're going to be able to survive in the same environment much better, and they're all going to be able to fulfill their specific roles. So increasing biodiversity is good. Oops, not good. Likewise, decreasing biodiversity is bad. And decreasing biodiversity is a result of when organisms start to die off, extinction. That's a bad thing, because that means that there are less organisms to fulfill those different roles, and sometimes those jobs aren't completed, and if they're not completed, the organisms that depend on those jobs being done are going to suffer, right? So decreasing biodiversity is a problem in the world that we're having, and it's important to recognize that the reason that that biodiversity is necessary is really all about balance, right? And making sure that the ecosystem is in balance and that you're not missing certain roles being fulfilled. This pretty much wraps it up for our lesson on organism relationships. If you have any questions, please see me.